On September 20th, 2025, at the Élysée Palace in Paris, Emmanuel Macron issued a harsh ultimatum. Burkina Faso has only 7 days to repay a massive debt of $8.4 billion or else 60% of the country's gold reserves and millions of hectares of agricultural land will be seized, and hydroelectric dams will be shut down, causing shockwaves across Africa and France. The whole world is waiting for the next move from Paris. Will Ibrahim Traoré take the hardest path to challenge Paris, or will it just remain a threat? Understand it this way: the entire power game is being overturned, forcing major economic machines to recalibrate every step with precision. He announced that Burkina Faso would repay $8.4 billion, a figure that made the whole world stop to listen and to be alert that the old era is undeniably over. $2.1 billion for the International Monetary Fund and $1.6 billion for the European Union for debt transfers, the rest allocated for investment and education. Infrastructure projects, $2 billion for the European Union for energy transition and education programs, $1.6 billion through the G7 African Development Fund, and finally $1 billion directly to France in the form of bilateral investment. Macron's voice grew sharper as he reminded the world that Paris had guaranteed over $4.5 billion in the total of this amount, and he asserted that this gives France a moral and financial right to demand repayment. This conclusion is blunt, even ruthless. Ouagadougou must deliver within 7 days. If not, Burkina Faso will be forced to surrender 60% of its gold reserves and no less than 5 million hectares of agricultural land. And if the country refuses, they will have to bear the full brunt of Western sanctions. For those listening across Africa and for those of us following through the lens of African news, this is not a typical policy speech. It is an ultimatum, a warning, and for many, it is an insult. Macron presented this demand as justice, but for millions, it sounds like the return of colonial arrogance disguised in financial language. The message is very clear: pay up or be punished. However, behind these numbers and deadlines is another story, a story about how these debts were created in the first place and who truly benefits from these so-called investments. But, as you will see, this is just the beginning of the reckoning. After Macron's ultimatum, the French president sought to justify his demand with a list of investments that France has poured into Burkina Faso. He read them like a ledger of favors, but for many in Africa, they sound more like an exploitation bill. First is the Ziga 2 hydroelectric dam built from 2019 to 2022 at a cost of $750 million. Built by a giant French energy conglomerate, the electricity is mainly sold to foreign companies, while the local community does not benefit much from the power outages. Then, the Ouagadougou-Abidjan Railway is being renovated from 2020 to 2024, with $1.2 billion from the joint funding sources of France and the EU. Instead of cutting costs, shipping rates have doubled, putting a burden on local traders and farmers. He talks about the Digital Sahel, a telecommunications network worth $1.5 billion launched in 2018. The French provide the technology and quietly control crucial data streams. Next is the Kédougou gold mining area, a $2 billion project in which French companies hold 70% ownership, leaving Burkina Faso with only 30% of the resources extracted from its own land. Finally, he cites the French language education program, costing $500 million. Although framed as an investment in literacy, this initiative has actually eliminated many indigenous languages from the classroom, replacing them with a colonial language. According to Macron, these projects demonstrate that Burkina Faso owes its creditors not only in gratitude, but also financially. However, for millions of Africans following news about Africa, they reveal something different, a model of resource exploitation disguised as development. And so the tensions rise. Crowds gather in Ouagadougou. Anger begins to replace despair. A reckoning is about to happen. But the real storm broke when Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward before his people. In the capital, Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré took the stage at the National Square and faced the sea of people voicing their opposition. The young leader did not beat around the bush. He spoke with all the weight of history, reminding the people and the world that France has never given anything back that they have taken away. Just look at what they call investment. Traoré declared that loans flow in, but profits flow out to Paris, Brussels, and Washington. We are left with dust and pain, he reminded the world that for over a century, Africa's gold, cotton, cocoa, and uranium have fueled France's prosperity. He recalled millions of Africans forced to work under colonial rule. He stated that even today, French mining companies still make over $2 billion each year from the land of Burkina Faso, while the country remains one of the poorest in the world with a per capita income of less than $1,000. His words resonated like thunder through the crowd. This is not just a financial dispute. It is the exposure of an empire of debt. People shouted, raising their fists, "No more chains, no more lies." For older Americans watching news about Africa, this moment evokes memories of past liberation, struggles from the time of the American Revolution to global civil rights movements. Traoré not only defends the dignity of Burkina Faso, but also challenges the global power structure. The voice of the young president grew stronger. "We will not sell our gold. We will not sell our land. If they want to shed blood, they will have to face all of Burkina Faso. And behind us, Africa is always united. This is the flashpoint. The ultimatum has become the challenge. And that challenge sparked a movement. But Traoré hasn't stopped yet. His next words are even more profound, revealing the hidden costs of what France calls progress. When the crowd's opportunity arose, Traoré's tone changed. He began to peel back the layers of what Paris calls progress. What he reveals is not progress, but social, cultural, and human devastation. He states that their so-called investments have destroyed our way of life. He recounts sacred cemeteries being flattened for factories, ancestral lands being bulldozed to mine for gold. Villages are forced to abandon their traditions as land is seized to build industrial farms. Children, once the hope of Burkina Faso, are now pulled from classrooms to work tirelessly in mines owned by multinational corporations. The languages of their ancestors, Mossi, Fulf, Dula, are gradually disappearing due to mandatory French curricula. Traoré paints a picture so clear it cannot be ignored. Respiratory illnesses have increased by 30% due to toxic dust from the gold mines and power plants. Over 50,000 families have lost farmland, wandering homeless or without livelihoods. The majestic Volta River, once a source of life, is now polluted by industrial waste from hydroelectric dams and mining activities. Fish float lifeless on the surface, a haunting symbol of what has been lost. For Americans hearing news about Africa, these are not abstract statistics. These are stories about people. Stories of children coughing at night, mothers crying over land they can no longer farm, and the mourning traditions of elders being erased for the sake of development. This is not just an economic dispute. It is a human crisis stemming from debt and foreign control. And then, as dusk falls over the capital, the moment of challenge becomes something greater, a movement carrying the voice of an entire nation. As the sun sets on the horizon, the national square in Ouagadougou fills with a new energy. The people are no longer just protesting debt, they are reclaiming their identity. This is not just a political drama, it is a declaration of independence, a rebirth into the 21st century. Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries in the world, has risen against the might of the West. And through news about Africa, the whole world is watching. In homes across the country, ordinary people whisper proudly, "Finally, there is someone speaking up for us." Landless farmers, mothers who have buried their children, those suffering from related illnesses, students whose mother tongue has been silenced. They all hear their struggle echoed from the podium. But the impact extends far beyond Burkina Faso. Across the Sahel, people in Mali and Niger have been watching. They see in Traoré not just a leader is not just a reflection of their own suffering, but also the ability to overcome that pain. This is no longer an argument about money. It's a call for unity, and soon the rest of the world will have to respond. This is an ultimatum. Starting in Paris, it quickly turned into an international crisis. Western capitals acted swiftly, warning that Burkina Faso refusing to comply would lead to comprehensive sanctions. The message from Paris, Brussels, and even Washington was nearly unanimous. This challenge would not be tolerated. However, the story reported by Africa News revealed a different reality. Burkina Faso is not the only country. Almost immediately, Traoré reached out to his neighbors Mali and Niger, calling for solidarity under the banner of the Sahel Alliance. These countries, which have long suffered from similar debts and foreign pressure, responded with public support. What started as a demand from France now risks uniting the entire region against European influence, and the geopolitical chessboard has shifted further. Moscow saw an opportunity. Russian officials offered emergency financial aid, promising that Burkina Faso would not need to hand over its gold. Beijing followed suit, showing a willingness to expand infrastructure support in exchange for partnerships based on mutual respect. 4. The United States. This moment is truly complex. On one hand, Washington traditionally sides with European allies. On the other hand, the U.S. has its own ambitions in Africa, seeking partnerships that could balance both Russia and China. Senior policymakers whisper that perhaps France's tough ultimatum has gone too far and too fast. The question remains whether the U.S. will closely align with Paris or adjust its approach towards emerging African leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. And as the world debates, the voice from Burkina Faso grows louder. This issue is no longer just about debt. It's about a continent demanding to be heard. News agencies around the world have published these images. A sea of protesters in Ouagadougou, the fiery words of Ibrahim Traoré, and a nation's challenge against one of Europe's most powerful leaders. Africa News reported with a headline that quickly spread across the continent. Burkina Faso says no to the debt chain in Africa. Traoré's speech resonated with millions from Dar to Kinshasa. Ordinary people hailed him as the one brave enough to confront the dead empire. In Mali and Niger, leaders pledged full support, viewing Burkina Faso's stance as a collective struggle for Africa. Across social media, the phrase, "no debt to be paid in blood," has trended in many languages, garnering sympathy from across the continent. In Europe, the mood is different. Governments worry that if Burkina Faso succeeds, other African countries may follow suit. Editorials in Paris and Brussels warn of a new wave of resistance that could threaten decades of political and economic influence. Macron finds himself cornered not just by the words of Ibrahim Traoré, but also by the symbol that now defines him as the face of a crumbling colonial order. And in the United States, the response is also divided into various streams. Some policymakers urge caution, arguing that America should not alienate the new generation of leadership in Africa. Others push for solidarity with France, fearing that hesitation will only push Burkina Faso deeper into the arms of Moscow and Beijing. But there is an undeniable truth. This is no longer just a local dispute. It is a global confrontation over who will shape the future of Africa. And at the center of all this is Ibrahim Traoré, a man once underestimated, now seen as a challenging voice for an entire continent. What began as a debt dispute has turned into a referendum on freedom, and the next chapter promises to be even more surprising. Sanctions have been imposed at an astonishing rate, even faster than the most seasoned analysts in Washington, Brussels, or Ouagadougou could predict. Western banks did not wait to assess the political fallout. They acted immediately, freezing credit limits that help sustain Burkina Faso's modest economy. European diplomats have escalated tensions, not only hinting at consequences, but also openly warning of travel bans, asset freezes, and blacklisting across financial markets. The air is thick with threats. Isolation from trade networks, exclusion from investment flows, a deliberate effort to label a country as a pariah. For many observers in the international press, this outcome seems inevitable. They believe that Burkina Faso, a small landlocked country struggling with poverty, will buckle under the pressure. They argue that in the face of sanctions, panic will spread throughout government ministries, business confidence will collapse, and within days, Ibrahim Traoré will be forced to concede to Paris. This is a familiar tactic that has been employed many times in Africa and elsewhere, but this time, the scenario is not unfolding as expected. Because Ibrahim Traoré had studied the chessboard long before, Macron took action. In whispered conversations away from the cameras, Traoré laid the groundwork for an alternative lifeline. In Moscow, Russian officials signaled their readiness to provide direct budget support, ensuring that government salaries could be paid and essential services would not be disrupted. In Beijing, envoys made it clear that China was willing to directly purchase Burkina Faso's gold and agricultural products, offering reasonable market prices without the political strings attached that come with loans from the West. This is not charity. It is the strategic restructuring, and within a few days, the logic of the crisis has changed significantly. What Paris intended to do as a killer blow has suddenly turned into a catalyst for diversification. Instead of retreating, Burkina Faso realized that the sanctions could serve as a coercive mechanism, pushing the country to explore new partnerships. It had been considered for a long time, but had never really been accepted. This irony is astonishing, especially for older Americans following the story through African news. Macron's ultimatum was presented as a show of strength aimed at bringing down a small nation in Africa and reaffirming European influence. But the result was the opposite. It opened the door for new allies, new trade routes, and a restored sense of sovereignty. What should have been a humiliating retreat turned into an opportunity for recalibration. However, the most profound change isn't about the balance sheet or commodity contracts. It's symbolic, even spiritual, because crises of this scale not only test the economy, they transform leaders. Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed by critics as an inexperienced young soldier, now emerges before the people and the world as a completely different person, a defiant figure, an icon of dignity, and a living embodiment of Africa's spirit of resistance against the shackles of debt bondage. And this is the moment when observers begin to understand. The sanctions that were supposed to break Burkina Faso instead began to shape a new identity for the country. What started as a bold gamble by a young leader has now become something much greater, a moment of irreversible change. Ibrahim Traoré, once mocked by skeptics as too inexperienced, too radical, or simply too young, now stands before his country and the world observing as someone more than just a politician. He has become a living symbol of resistance. This irony cannot be overlooked. Emmanuel Macron's ultimatum, issued as a tool of humiliation intended to force Burkina Faso into submission, has backfired miserably. Instead of weakening Traoré, it has turned him into a symbol of Africa's defiance. The very act aimed at belittling him has elevated him to a position few leaders of his generation could achieve. Across the continent, the transformation is evident not only in policy statements or diplomatic cables, but also on the streets themselves. Murals of Traoré's face have started appearing on city walls from Ouagadougou to Bamako, painted by local artists who see in him the spirit of a resilient generation. Children wear T-shirts with his image. Students quote his speeches at rallies. In Mali and Niger, spontaneous crowds gather, chanting his name like that expresses their anger and hope succinctly. Even outside the borders of Africa, migrant communities in Europe and the United States are also responding to this rapidly spreading slogan. The man has broken the empire of debt. Meanwhile, Paris finds itself on the defensive. Macron's government, once confident in its ability to set the terms, has struggled to explain why their ultimatum led to results opposite to what they intended. Analysts on chat shows in Europe have debated whether the sanctions have actually pushed Burkina Faso closer to Moscow and Beijing, completely undermining Western leverage. In the quiet corners of Brussels and Washington, policymakers are questioning whether Macron miscalculated to the extent of creating not just a crisis, but a counter-narrative, a place where France is the oppressor and Traoré is the liberator. And Traoré's position hasn't risen due to tanks or treasures, but because of something older and harder to measure, which is courage and defiance. He does not have a superpower army. He does not possess infinite wealth. He has the ability to speak plainly, expressing the anger of ordinary people and refusing to back down. Ironically, that is stronger than any arsenal for older American audiences, especially those following news about Africa. This shift creates familiar tones. They have seen this pattern before when unexpected figures, from farmers during the American colonial period to preachers during the civil rights era, emerged to embody freedom itself. In Einar's Traoré's challenge, they hear echoes of struggles where dignity is more important than comfort and principles outweigh fear. Burkina Faso has not yet won the larger battle. Sanctions still loom. The economy remains fragile. Threats from Paris and its allies are very real. However, in another sense, the country has achieved a victory, has taken control of the narrative. It has turned weakness into leverage, transforming insult into inspiration. It asserts something more enduring than temporary liberation, the power of the story, the spirit of dignity, the belief that the worth of a nation cannot be measured merely by debt or gold. Ultimately, the empire of debt has unwittingly created its own enemy, and that enemy has a name that has been raised on murals, songs, radio shows, and whispered with pride. Throughout the Sahel, his name is Ibrahim Traoré. Burkina Faso has not yet escaped the storm. Sanctions remain a threat, and pressure from global powers is still immense, but an irreversible change has occurred. A country once viewed as powerless has found its voice, and President Ibrahim Traoré's voice reminds the world that dignity is not for sale. In villages once ravaged by displacement, the people can now express their joy, hope. In the classroom, children whisper that one day they too can rise up against injustice. And on the streets of Ouagadougou, the slogan still echoes, "No debt is paid in blood." This is not just a political issue, it's the rebirth of the people's pride. This is news about Africa that reports not only on the headlines, but also on the history unfolding before our eyes. Like Traoré declared, "We do not ask for permission to be free. We have risen to take it." If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, please share this story. If you believe that the courage of Burkina Faso represents not just a nation, but also speaks to the dignity of all people, subscribe to this channel. Together, let us follow the journey of an Africa that will never bow its head again. God bless Africa.